The cabin had been empty for as long as I'd been a park ranger. Everyone called it the old man's cabin because years ago, some old guy had lived there by himself. He vanished one winter, and the place was left to fall apart. My job was to check on it every so often, just to make sure no one was staying there or animals hadn't made it their home. It was late fall when I went for my last visit of the year. Most of the leaves were on the ground, the trees looked bare, and the trails were quiet. The cabin was far from the main ranger station, about a mile off the regular paths. It always gave me an uneasy feeling, even in daylight. The wood was dark and worn, making it look almost black against the gray sky. The windows were filthy, and the door was cracked open, swinging a little in the breeze. I'd been to the cabin many times before, but something felt off this time. The air felt heavy, and the woods were too quiet. No birds, no rustling leaves, just the crunch of my boots on the cold ground. When I got to the porch, I noticed something that hadn't been there before. Footprints. They were faint but clear enough to see, leading from the trees straight to the cabin. They looked fresh, like someone wearing boots had walked there recently. I tried to tell myself they might have been mine from before, but deep down, I knew they weren't. I pushed the door open, and the sound of it creaking echoed in the silence. Inside, the cabin looked the same as it always did, empty and forgotten. There was the old cot, the rusty stove, and a small table covered in dust. But something felt different. The air was warmer than it should have been for an abandoned place, and I could smell something faintly like smoke, like someone had lit a fire not long ago. I looked around, trying to see what was out of place. That's when I noticed a metal box sitting on the table. It didn't have any dust on it, like someone had just put it there. I walked over and opened it. Inside were some folded papers and an old photo. The picture was of a man. Scruffy beard, tired eyes, wearing a plaid shirt. It looked old, but there was something about his face that seemed familiar, though I couldn't place it. While I stood there staring at the photo, I heard it. A soft creak, like wood bending under someone's weight, came from the back of the cabin. My stomach tightened. It wasn't the wind, and it wasn't just the building settling. It sounded like footsteps. I spun around and shone my flashlight toward the sound. The back corner of the room looked empty, just like always. But then I saw the storage closet door. It was open a crack. That door was always shut when I came here. My mind told me to leave, but my legs wouldn't move. Slowly, I stepped toward the closet. My flashlight shook in my hand as I reached out and pushed the door open all the way. The closet was empty, just some old shelves and a broken lantern on the floor. I let out a shaky breath, but as I took a step back, I felt something behind me. It wasn't someone, it was something hanging. I turned quickly, and my flashlight caught it. A rope, a noose, swinging lightly, right where I had been standing just moments ago. My blood ran cold. That rope hadn't been there when I walked in. That was it for me. I backed out of the cabin and ran as fast as I could, not caring about the footprints or the warm air anymore. By the time I reached the main trail, I was out of breath, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold my flashlight. The next morning, I told my boss what I'd seen. We went back together, but the cabin was just like it always was, empty and falling apart. No noose, no box on the table, no footprints. He gave me a look like I was crazy, but I knew what I saw. Since then, I haven't gone near the old man's cabin. But I still feel it, even when I'm far from that place. When I'm out in the woods, I feel like someone's watching me. I found fresh footprints where no one else should have been, leading off into the trees. I stopped trying to explain it to anyone. They all say it's just in my head. But I know better. Someone's still out there. They don't live in the cabin anymore. They're in the woods now. And they're waiting for something. Or someone. Maybe next time they won't let me leave. I decided to spend a week at the cabin my husband and I had built together. After he passed, it felt like the only place I could really breathe. The cabin sat deep in the woods, far from the noise of the city. Big trees surrounded it, and a small stream ran nearby. It had always been our escape, and I thought being there might make me feel closer to him. The first few days were quiet. I cleaned up, moved some things around, and sat on the porch with coffee, listening to the sounds of the forest. At night, I read by lantern light since I hadn't bothered to turn the power back on. For the first time in months, I felt a little calm. On the third night, I woke up to a noise outside. It sounded like something moving around near the shed behind the cabin. I figured it was just an animal, maybe a raccoon or a deer, but it was loud enough to make me sit up. I told myself not to worry, turned over, and tried to sleep. The next morning, I went out to check. The shed door was wide open, and some tools were lying on the ground. That wasn't like me. I was always careful about closing it. I figured I must have forgotten. Grief can make your mind fuzzy, right? I shook it off and went about my day. That night, I locked the shed and the cabin door before bed. I even checked twice to be sure. But when I woke up, something felt off. The air inside the cabin was heavy, like I wasn't alone. I got up and looked out the windows from my bedroom. Everything seemed quiet, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was out there. The next morning, I found footprints in the dirt outside. They were big, much bigger than mine, and they circled the entire cabin. Whoever it was had even come up to the windows. My stomach turned. This wasn't an animal. That's when I decided I wasn't staying another night. I packed my things during the day and planned to leave first thing in the morning. But as the sun went down, the woods seemed darker than they should have been. I felt like someone was watching me. Every creak of the cabin sounded louder. Every noise outside felt closer. Around midnight, I heard it again. Footsteps. They were slow, steady, and circling the cabin. My chest tightened, and I froze in bed. My heart was racing, but I couldn't bring myself to move. The footsteps got closer, and I could hear them on the porch. I gripped my phone, but there was no signal this far out. Then they stopped at the front door. The knob rattled. I thought about running, but where would I go? The woods were endless, and I'd never make it to my car without being seen. The rattling stopped, and for a few minutes, there was nothing but silence. At dawn, I forced myself to go outside. The air felt colder, like the forest had changed overnight. On the porch, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A knife was stuck into the railing, and next to it, the word "mine" was scratched into the wood. I didn't waste time. I grabbed my bag, got in the car, and drove off as fast as I could. My hands were shaking the whole way. When I looked in the rearview mirror, I thought I saw something or someone standing at the edge of the trees. I never went back. I sold the cabin to a stranger and didn't even collect my things. But sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I think about the footprints circling the cabin. I think about the knife and the word carved into the wood. And I wonder if whoever or whatever was out there that night has found someone else's cabin to call theirs. Last summer, I stayed at a small cabin in the woods for a week. It was July 2019, and I needed a break from work and the noise of the city. The cabin wasn't much, just one room with a bed, a tiny kitchen, and a small bathroom. It sat at the end of a dirt road surrounded by trees. It was quiet, exactly what I needed. The first few days were great. I'd sit on the porch with my coffee in the mornings and take walks during the afternoons. The air smelled fresh, like pine trees, and I could hear birds singing and leaves rustling now and then. But on the fourth day, something felt different. The air seemed heavier, and the woods felt too quiet, like everything had stopped moving. That morning, I decided to check out a trail behind the cabin. The cabin owner had told me about it, but said it wasn't used much anymore. I thought I'd explore for a little while and turn back if it got too hard to follow. At first, the trail was fine, but soon it became overgrown. The trees got thicker, and less sunlight made it through the branches. After about 20 minutes, I noticed a bad smell. It was sharp and sour, like garbage left out in the sun too long. I stopped, thinking maybe it was a dead animal. I thought about turning back, but decided to go just a little further. The smell got worse, and then I saw what was causing it. In a small, open spot just off the trail, there was a body. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a deer, but as I got closer, I realized it was a man. He was lying on his side, his clothes ripped and dirty. His face was swollen, and his skin looked wrong, almost gray. There were flies everywhere. I froze. My mind was racing. Who was he? How did he end up here? I wanted to turn and run, but I couldn't move. I just stood there, staring at him, feeling like I was trespassing, like I shouldn't have seen this. Eventually, I snapped out of it. I started backing away slowly, keeping my eyes on the body. Once I felt far enough, I turned and ran. The branches scratched my arms, and I tripped a couple of times, but I didn't stop until I got back to the cabin. When I got inside, I locked the door and sat on the floor, trying to calm down. My hands were shaking, and my heart was racing. I wanted to call the police, but my phone didn't have any service out there. I thought about driving into town, but it was miles away, and the sun was starting to set. I decided to wait until morning. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every little noise outside made me jump. I kept thinking about the body and how long it had been out there. I started to wonder if someone else had put him there. The thought made my skin crawl. I stayed up all night, staring at the door, waiting for the first light of day. At sunrise, I packed my stuff, got in my car, and drove straight to town. I found the nearest police station and told them everything. The sheriff asked me a lot of questions and then went out to check. They found the body exactly where I said it was. A few days later, I heard the man had been missing for weeks. They said he was probably hiking and got lost. But something didn't feel right. His clothes were torn, and his injuries didn't look like something you'd get from just being lost in the woods. And I couldn't understand how no one had noticed him being so close to the cabin. I haven't been back to that cabin since. Sometimes I think about the body and how quiet the woods felt that day. But what really gets to me is something the sheriff said before I left. He mentioned finding footprints around the body. They didn't belong to the man, and they weren't mine either. They led off into the woods and disappeared. I still wonder who else was out there, or worse, if they're still there. That night, the rain started slow but steady. My cousin and I were at the family cabin, deep in the woods. It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend, just the two of us. But something about the rain and being so far from everything felt strange. The wind shook the windows, and the sound of raindrops hitting the roof drowned out almost every other noise. We had a small fire going in the fireplace, but it wasn't enough to light up the whole room. The cabin felt warm during the day, but at night, the shadows seemed to grow and move in ways that made me uneasy. The only other light came from a lantern on the table that flickered every now and then. We sat quietly for a while, scrolling on our phones, but the signal was weak, and our batteries were running out fast. There wasn't much to do, so we decided to lock everything up and get some rest. I went around checking the doors and windows, making sure they were all locked. By the time we were ready to sleep, the rain had gotten heavier. My cousin went to the bedroom, and I stayed on the couch in the living room. I liked being near the main door, just in case. The door creaked when the wind blew, but it was solid enough to hold. I don't know what time it was when I woke up. Something had pulled me out of sleep, It wasn't the rain or the wind. This sound was different. Sharp, like something scratching against wood. I stayed completely still, listening. Maybe it was a branch, I told myself, or an animal. But then it happened again, louder this time. It was coming from the back of the cabin. I sat up slowly, trying not to make any noise. I reached for the flashlight we kept near the door and pointed it toward the back window. The rain made it hard to see much, but for a second, I thought I saw something move near the shed. I stared at the spot, waiting to see it again, but there was nothing. Maybe the rain was messing with my eyes. Then I heard it, a loud thud against the back door. My chest tightened, and I froze, not sure what to do. Another thud came, harder this time, followed by a dragging sound, like something being pulled along the ground. It wasn't the kind of noise you'd hear from an animal. It was too heavy, too deliberate. I got up and went to the bedroom. I shook my cousin awake and signaled for him to be quiet. He could tell by my face that something was wrong. We grabbed a kitchen knife and the flashlight and waited by the front door. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might give us away. The noises at the back door stopped, but then we heard footsteps. They weren't fast or panicked. They were slow, steady, circling the cabin. Every step crunched on the wet ground, getting closer and closer to the front door. Then they stopped. We stood there, barely breathing. The rain was the only sound now, pounding against the roof and windows. Minutes passed, but it felt like hours. I wanted to peek out the window, but I couldn't bring myself to move. Finally, when it felt safe enough, I worked up the nerve to look. I moved the curtain just enough to see outside. Nothing. No footprints, no movement, nothing at all. But I didn't feel relieved. Something was wrong, and I couldn't shake it. The rest of the night, we didn't sleep. We stayed near the front door, the knife close by, waiting for the first light of morning. When the rain finally stopped, and it was bright enough to see, we went outside to check around the cabin. At the back door, there were deep scratches in the wood. They weren't random. They looked like someone had dragged something sharp across the surface over and over. Leading away from the cabin were boot prints, faint in the mud, but they were bigger than either of us. They disappeared into the woods. We didn't waste any time packing up. By the time we drove off, the sky was clear, and the sun was shining, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching us leave. A week later, I got a call from my uncle, the cabin's owner. He wanted to know if we had left the back door open when we left. I told him we hadn't, but he said it was wide open when he arrived. Inside, the table had been moved, and there were muddy footprints leading from the back door to the couch where I had slept. I didn't say much after that. I just told him we wouldn't be going back. Whatever had been outside that night hadn't left. It had been inside the whole time. I've been a sergeant for over 10 years, and I've seen a lot of scary stuff. But nothing really prepared me for that night in the woods. We were after a criminal, one of the worst I've dealt with. He'd been on the run for weeks after committing a bunch of violent crimes. We got a tip that he was hiding out in a cabin deep in the woods, about 5 miles from the nearest road. No one would find it by accident. My team and I were ready, but as I got closer to the area, I had this feeling something wasn't right. The dirt road that led to the cabin was covered in weeds and old tracks, but they weren't fresh. There was no sign of anyone being around recently, but the person who tipped us off swore he was here. The air felt thick, heavy, and the usual sounds of the woods, birds, insects, even the wind, were strangely quiet. When I first saw the cabin, I felt a chill. It wasn't falling apart, but it was clear no one had bothered to take care of it for years. The windows were dark, and the door was cracked open, like it hadn't been shut properly. I told my team to stay put while I went in to check it out. My boots creaked on the porch as I stepped forward, and the smell hit me hard. rotting food and something that smelled like metal. Blood, maybe. Inside, it was a mess. Food cans, papers, and clothes were scattered everywhere. It looked like someone had been living there for a while. There were logs burned halfway in the fireplace, a mattress thrown on the floor, and a dirty plate with dried food on it. But what really got to me was the wall in the corner. It was covered in pictures from newspapers, photos of victims, and handwritten notes. It was like a shrine to his crimes and his plans. I was trying to make sense of it all when I heard a faint crack outside. My heart skipped a beat. I had been so focused on the cabin, I hadn't realized I was being watched. I ducked into the shadows, weapon ready, and waited. The minutes dragged by, but there was no sound. The silence felt like it was closing in on me. Then I noticed something strange. On the desk, near the shrine, there was a small, beaten-up notebook. I grabbed it and flipped through the pages. My stomach twisted. It was a list of names, dates, and places. His next targets. I knew then that he hadn't been hiding in that cabin. He'd been using it as a base, planning his next moves. And based on the notes, he wasn't far. I could feel the air change before I heard anything. Slow, steady footsteps coming from behind the cabin. He wasn't just watching me, he was tracking me, hunting me. My blood ran cold. I moved fast, slipping out the front door and circling the cabin. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. As I turned the corner, I saw a shadow dart between the trees. He was moving deeper into the woods. I followed, keeping as quiet as possible, but he was leading me into the forest. Every so often, I'd hear the crunch of leaves, catch a flicker of movement in the distance, but then nothing. It was like he was playing a game with me, toying with me. The woods were thick, a maze of trees, and he knew them better than I did. I was getting more and more disoriented as I followed him deeper into the forest. After what felt like forever, I came to a clearing. The moonlight lit up a small, makeshift campsite. No fire, just a tarp and some supplies scattered around. My eyes searched the area, but he was gone. My radio crackled to life, and I heard my team's voices calling for me, but I didn't respond. Something felt wrong. I couldn't explain it, but I knew I wasn't alone. And then I saw it. On the tarp, in big, messy letters, was a new notebook open to a fresh page. It wasn't the same one I had found in the cabin. The words written in it were clear, "I see you." Before I could process what I was reading, I felt it. The unmistakable feeling of someone behind me. My body froze. I tried to turn, but it was too late. A sharp blow to the back of my head knocked me out cold. The last thing I remember was hearing a soft, twisted laugh echoing through the trees, fading into the night. When I woke up, I was lying in the clearing, my head pounding. My team had found me, but when I looked around, everything was gone. The tarp, the supplies, the notebook. The criminal had vanished without a trace. The only thing left was the feeling of dread that gripped me. It was clear he had been watching me the entire time. He had planned everything, making sure I was always one step behind. I don't know if I was his target that night or just part of a twisted game he liked to play. Even now, I can't shake the feeling that he's still out there, watching, waiting. Every time I step into the woods, I'm looking over my shoulder. I wonder how many times he's done this before, leading someone like me into a trap. And I can't stop thinking about those words on the tarp. I see you. Every time I close my eyes, I hear that laugh, that twisted sound echoing in my mind. The worst part is, I don't think I'll ever be free of it. Because if he really is out there, I know he's still watching, waiting for the next time. And I can't shake the feeling that it's only a matter of time before he comes for me again. I hadn't been to my grandma's old cabin in years, but when it finally became mine, I figured I should go back and see it again. The cabin had been in the family for a long time, and I spent a lot of summers there when I was younger. It was way out in the woods, far from the nearest town, and surrounded by trees and thick bushes. The silence there was so deep, it almost felt like it was pressing on you. I got there late in the day, just before the sun went down, and started unpacking. The cabin was old, really old. The floorboards creaked when I stepped on them, and the walls had that musty smell of old wood and dust. The windows had cracks, and the furniture was covered in dusty sheets. There was something about the place that just didn't feel right. Maybe it was the way everything was so quiet, or the memories of how it used to feel when I was a kid. As the sun set and night crept in, I was alone, except for a few of my grandma's old things left behind. But it wasn't the furniture or the dust that caught my attention. It was a sound. At first, I thought it was just the wind. The cabin always made strange sounds when the wind blew through the cracks in the walls. But this was different. It was a soft, steady tapping, like someone was gently knocking on the window. I stopped what I was doing and listened closely. This wasn't the wind. It was too constant, too deliberate. My heart started racing, and I walked over to the window, trying to see what it was. All I could make out were the dark shapes of the trees swaying in the wind, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I tried to ignore it, telling myself I was just being paranoid. I've always been a little jumpy, but the tapping didn't stop. It moved from one window to the next, almost like someone was walking around the cabin, tapping on each window. I felt a rush of panic. Was someone out there? Maybe someone from the village was messing with me? But the village was miles away, and the closest neighbor was over an hour's walk away. No one had come up here in years. I had to find out. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside, the cold night air hitting my skin. The beam of the flashlight flickered as I moved, and for a moment, everything felt wrong. It was like I was walking in a bad dream. I circled the cabin, shining the light on the windows, but there was no one there. Nothing but the trees swaying and the dark, empty woods. When I reached the back of the cabin, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A thin, fresh trail of dirt was scratched up in a straight line, like someone had walked carefully around the cabin, making sure not to leave any obvious footprints. My hand shook as I followed the trail. The flashlight beam bounced around in the dark, lighting up the trees and uneven ground. The trail led to the edge of the woods, where the trees grew thick and the ground dropped into a steep hill. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the trail stopped. It was like whoever had walked it just disappeared. My heart pounded as I stood there, staring at the empty space. The woods were dead silent. No sounds, no movement, just the thick darkness pressing in. I could feel the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I looked around, but there was no one, just trees, shadows, and the kind of quiet that made everything seem unnatural. I spent the rest of the night inside, locked up tight. I checked every window, double-checked the doors, and sat by the fire, too scared to sleep. The tapping never came back, but the feeling of being watched didn't go away. It was like something was waiting just outside, waiting for me to leave the safety of the cabin. The next morning, I couldn't get out of there fast enough. I was done. Whatever had been out there, whatever I had heard, I didn't want to be around for it. But as I was about to leave, I decided to check the cabin one last time. I didn't know why. Maybe I thought I missed something. That's when I saw it. The doorknob. It had scratches on it, not deep, but enough to notice, like someone had tried to get in during the night. The thought of it made my stomach drop. I hadn't noticed it before, and it definitely wasn't like that when I first arrived. I locked the door, grabbed my things, and left that place for good. I didn't care if it was my grandma's cabin or not. There was something wrong with that place, something I couldn't explain, but felt deep in my bones. Maybe it was the isolation. Maybe it was the strange sounds. Maybe it was the fact that whoever or whatever had been out there, was still nearby, still watching. I don't know what it was, but I swear I heard something moving in the woods as I drove away. Maybe it was just the wind, maybe not. Either way, I didn't look back. I knew I would never set foot on that land again. Whatever had been there wasn't gone. And if I had stayed, I don't think I would have left with my mind intact. I never went back to that village. Not even once. The cabin's still out there, I guess. But it's someone else's problem now. I hope they never hear the tapping. I had been driving for what felt like forever, the road winding through thick woods, when I finally saw the cabin. It was dark by then, and I felt a bit of relief seeing the small, old house up ahead. It wasn't fancy, but it was far away from everything, just what I wanted. I had rented it for the weekend, hoping to get some peace and quiet. After a stressful few weeks, I was looking forward to being alone for a while. The cabin was tucked in the woods, and behind it was a little graveyard. I could see the old gravestones, some half hidden by vines and weeds, barely standing in the fading light. At first, it didn't bother me. It was just part of the place's history. I figured, something I could ignore. I spent the evening inside, reading a book and listening to the wind rustling the trees. It was quiet outside, too quiet, almost. By the time I went to bed, the moon was full and bright, casting strange shadows through the windows. I felt a little uneasy, but I told myself it was just the silence, the isolation. I tried to relax, but something didn't feel right. Around midnight, I suddenly woke up, wide awake. I didn't know what had made me open my eyes, but I had this feeling, like someone was watching me. My skin tingled, and the room felt colder, even though the heater was running. I sat up in bed, looking around. I was probably just imagining things. But then I noticed something outside the window. Something moved near the graveyard. My heart skipped a beat, and I froze. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't the wind either. I could see the shape of a person walking between the gravestones. I couldn't make out their face, but they were definitely there, moving slowly through the shadows. My breath caught in my chest, and I slowly backed away from the window, pressing myself against the wall. Whoever it was didn't seem to notice me. I stood there, not sure what to do. Maybe it was just someone passing through. But who would be out there in the middle of nowhere in the middle of the night? My hands were shaking as I quietly crept toward the back door, just in case. I peeked through the blinds, but the person was gone. I thought I might have been imagining it all, but I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, just the wind or my mind playing tricks. I spent the rest of the night wide awake, listening to every creak of the cabin, every whisper of the trees outside. The silence was suffocating. When the sun came up, I felt like I had put the whole thing out of my mind. I told myself it was just a weird dream or my mind getting the best of me. But when I stepped outside to get some air, I couldn't help but look toward the graveyard again. This time, something was different. The ground near the gravestones was dug up. It looked fresh, like someone had recently been digging. My stomach turned as I walked closer. I saw footprints in the dirt, leading toward a grave that was older and more worn than the others. I swallowed hard, trying to make sense of it, but my mind couldn't come up with any explanation. I took a step back, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. I didn't want to stay there any longer. I grabbed my things, my hands trembling, and left the cabin in a hurry. As I drove away, I felt a heavy weight in my chest. The whole time I was on the road, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever I had seen that night wasn't just a person. No, it wasn't a person at all. It was something else, something that didn't belong there. It was like a part of the land itself, dark and ancient. It wasn't until I was a few miles down the road, my mind still racing, that I realized the worst part. There had been no car, No sound of anything moving except for the wind. Whoever or whatever had been out there hadn't come from the road or the woods. They had come from the graveyard itself. And I couldn't help but wonder, how many others had been there before me? How many more would come after me? That's when the real horror hit. The feeling of being watched didn't stop. Even though I was miles away, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still out there, waiting, lingering in the woods. And it knew I had seen it. It knew I had left. And it wasn't done with me yet.